part of the Ying Quartet. I'm the cellist of the Ying Quartet, also on the faculty at Eastman School of Music. This is, I think, the first cello chat that I have hosted from my home and not from Eastman School of Music, because I kind of like to do them from Eastman because my studio happens to be Paul Katz's old studio. So where I had many of my lessons when I was working with Paul, and where Paul spent many an hour, so I like to think that there's a good cello bellow vibe in that room. But, you know, the pandemic has changed everything. So now I'm at home, and which is nice in other ways too. Maybe not as much cello bellow or Paul Katz vibe, but still good. And I also remember now that I think my last cello chat was in March, and I believe mine was the first cello chat that happened after all of the lockdowns began. And in fact, it was so alarming that I called Paul and said, should we have the cello chat? It's, you know, I mean, it feels like the sky is falling. And he said, yeah, we should do it. We should do it. It's important to have things online. And I understand in the meantime that that cello chats have only become more popular. So that is great to hear. I remember it was a strange feeling that day, just sort of talking about music when all these things were swirling around us. I suppose now things feel, even though they're still sort of anxiety producing, it's become more normalized at least. It's a normal level of anxiety maybe. So anyhow, here we are again, and I'm excited to be able to talk about music, and especially to think about the cello in times like this. So here we go. Let's see. I think there's the first question is telling us about tell us about your years with Leonard Rose. So first of all, I will say that it was not a long time. I studied with him only at the very end of his life, but I will say that the time that I spent with him was amongst the most influential of any of my cello studies. I think the main reason, besides the fact that Rose was an amazing teacher, was that I came in with such expectations and respect for him. I remember a lot of things about Leonard Rose. So some things I'll get to with the teaching is really super important, but there are some other things that I remember very clearly too. So for example, he was a fairly formal man. He was very serious, did not smile a lot. I found that intimidating in a way at first, but on the other hand, I felt like he was taking the lesson and me so seriously. He wore a complete a suit and tie. He did, I think, sometimes take off his jacket, but he never loosened his tie even. His lessons were exactly 1 hour. I admire this. I have a hard time staying on time sometimes. The lessons would start right at the beginning of the hour, and 60 minutes later, you were done, and it didn't seem incomplete, like he was cutting anything off. He had an amazing sense of internal clock about that. I'll tell you a funny story about his seriousness. So about maybe 3 or 4 lessons in, and oh, by the way, I was super, as I said, taking it super seriously too. So it was the one time in my life that I wore ties to my lesson. So I remember about 3rd or 4th lesson in, hanging on every word, trying to do every last detail that he said. At the end of the lesson, so it probably would have been exactly at minute 57, he leans in close over his cello and he leans in towards me and says, you know, you're very talented. And coming from Leonard Rose, I couldn't believe it. I thought, wow, like, I mean, I knew he taught Yo-Yo Ma. I thought Yo-Yo Ma was talented, and he's telling David Ying he's talented. And so I sort of just floated out of that lesson. I thought, wow, Leonard Rose thinks I'm talented. And only to find out a few days later in talking to other students that is like, yeah, he says that to everyone after their 3rd lesson. So then unfortunately my bubble has burst. But I learned an immense amount from him. I find myself still in my lessons saying things as if I thought of them, and then I go back to my notes of his first lessons. I took very careful notes and realized that he told me those exact same things. And in fact, there is a video on YouTube that I would recommend anyone who's curious about Leonard Rose's teaching ideas to watch. It's about 45 minutes long, and he outlines a lot of his basic stuff, especially with the bow arm. I haven't watched it for a while, but I remember when I watched it, it's like, yeah, that's exactly what he told me in my first lesson. So I recommend watching that. He was obviously a highly influential person, and I value every single minute that I was able to spend with him. I can still hear the sound of his cello playing in front of me in my ear. A magical sound. I grew up listening to his recordings, so to hear it in person at my lessons was wonderful. I could probably go on for the full hour and talk about Leonard Rose, but maybe let's look at a few other questions, and then maybe we can come back to Leonard Rose if we want to. Let's see. Next question is, how do you provide a better foundation to your quartet sound as the cellist? I've always struggled with balance, when to play more or less. So here's the thing. I feel that as a quartet cellist, that you will never overshadow the rest of the quartet in terms of volume, within reason. So what matters a lot more is how much you are in sync with what is going on, and how much you provide a sound that is in a way different from what's going on. So I don't worry too much that I'm playing too loud for the quartet, but I do want to make a sound that has breadth and not necessarily point, because point can sometimes not drown out other sounds, but distract you from other sounds. So while I want to have a very focused tone on the cello, I also want to have breadth in the sound, because I in a way I want to make the violins, who carry the melody a lot of the time, sound even more brilliant and high. So my ideal quartet sound, if everyone has their own, is to sort of be the bottom part of the orchestra. So I make sure that I play with a deep enough bow and a slow enough bow speed and enough pull in the sound. So I'm sort of working the angles of my bow lots of times to create color and an atmosphere and character in the sound and breadth in the sound, while at the same time hearing focus, so you can hear detail in what I'm doing. That's what I'm after in quartet. And of course, if I have the melody, then I will change the profile of the sound and try and become sort of more pointed, perhaps, in a way, in the sound, even more focused and even more detailed. But it's a great feeling to play cello and string quartet, because no one occupies your sound register. So it's very important what I think the cellists do. And for me, if I were just like the second viola or the fourth violin in the quartet, even if I were supporting what was going on and matching strokes and everything, it wouldn't be quite the same as if I'm occupying this different sort of sound register very actively. So let's see. Playing the ninth caprice, I have problems with my left hand. I can't stand when I play. Okay, so wait, I just have to be sure my memory is good. I'll be right back. The piano caprice is right here. So is that the D major one? Let's see, here we are. Yeah, D major, right. So it's interesting that you say you have problems with your left hand, because I always viewed this as an etude more for the right hand. And my students that play this, when they come in, they are very focused on the left hand, and we spend a lot of time talking more about the right hand. But left hand wise, I would try as possible. There's some places where you have to finger as like a quadruple stop. But wherever possible, I would try to play not holding double stops. So. So that I'm playing individual notes and going back and forth. The thing that I don't like about double stops is it sort of super tightens up your hand. So I try to, whenever I can, even when I'm playing triple stops, try to put my fingers down, in a sense, one at a time, as much as that's allowed. So that's one thing that I would say, Jorge. I, not having ever seen you play, I think another important factor in the left hand dexterity has to do with hand shape. So if the fingers are more curved and hanging, so that your thumb can press less back against the neck. In fact, if your thumb can press like not at all, then I think you'll have a lot less effort in putting your left hand fingers down, and especially with all these multi-stops. Oh, sorry. I thought my phone was on Do Not Disturb, but it somehow is disturbing me. Um, uh, if your left hand can operate without the force of your thumb coming back, you'll become much less tired playing multi-stops. So I try to practice also with like the thumb not even there and paying attention to the shape of my fingers here hanging. So if I play, for example, more straight fingers out here, then that requires a lot more force, like a clothespin, my fingers. So that's another thing that I would do. But again, it's hard for me to say, never having seen you play, Jorge. So, so hopefully what you saw there, if you could see it well, was a demonstration of all those things. My hand position being curved and hanging, my thumb not pushing back, you couldn't see that, but I was trying to be very light with my thumb, and then rolling my fingers like this, as opposed to holding them all down. So there's some tips that might help you keep your hand more relaxed, and if your hand's more relaxed, of course, you're going to get more dexterity and speed in it too. Let's see, I'm trying to go down the question are coming fast and furious. I'll try to answer them quickly. Felipe, oh, great to hear from you again. I love these cello chats because we can talk to people in Brazil. Let's see, can you talk about my Ruggieri cello? What do you like about it? Sounds great. I think it sounds great too. I'm glad you like it. I have been well, it's not mine. I've been borrowing this cello for quite a long time, so I feel like it is my sound on the cello. It's hard for me to play another cello and feel like it's quite like me. Although, so you can see my daughter's cello in the background. I like playing that too. It's a completely different cello, but it's fun for me to play other things. This cello has, I think the thing that I first enjoyed about it was the richness of the C string. And since I play quartets, having, as I was saying earlier about quartet sound, having a strong character and breadth in the bass is, to me, kind of, that's like cello. That says to me cello. Sometimes this cello, like if I play with piano, or I don't do it very often, but in the past I've played concertos, it doesn't quite have the edge and the sort of high overtones, pure high overtones that, and maybe sheer volume that other cellos have, some other cellos have. So I have to work a little harder in those situations. I have to be very clever about how I project the sound. And that's one reason why I like my daughter's cello, is because it's brighter, so it's fun to hear a different sound come out. But it would be really super hard for me to give up this cello now. And the A string. Also has a wonderful personality and different from the bass. That's another thing I like about this cello, is that each string is kind of different. I like to play it that way, so that there's almost like it's almost like a string quartet on the cello. Of course, you don't want to be able to switch registers without hearing great changes in color, but it's fun to be able to hear personality in an instrument. So that's probably the thing I like best about this cello. So thanks for asking about it. I feel super lucky to be able to play it. Let's see here. Best principles that help with body work for being relaxed and engaged. What is it? It's with my phone. It's totally on silence, but it's still ringing. Okay, so best principles that help with your body work for being relaxed and engaged with your music and instrument. So that is a sort of a big question. Is it Anna? Yeah, it's a big question, Anna. Because we're trying to relax all different parts of our body, and so there are some things that people work on to get more flexibility in your fingers over here, or to maybe have a vibrato that has flexibility in your fingers. We were talking earlier about the left hand, getting more dexterity and agility there. So a general principle that overlays it all. Okay, I do have a couple of thoughts there. If you're just thinking about how you sit at the cello and how your body functions, one very important thing is breathing. You have to be able to breathe. If you can't breathe, it's really hard to relax. And that's true kind of away from the cello too. Breathing is super important. I would say also one thing I try to think about is, well, okay, so let me preface it by saying that I've had teachers tell me since I was little, relax when you play the cello. And that, of course, is a great idea. But in some ways, I found it mystifying and not completely helpful because, of course, when you play the cello, you have to use your muscles. So you're not completely relaxing like the way you would be if you're laying on the laying on the couch watching TV. So one way that I like to think of all my muscle movements on the cello is that they are impulses that lead to release. And hopefully the sooner the better with the release. So, for example, a bow stroke, I'd like to think of it as like an impulse of my arm sinking into this string and initiating a bow stroke. But then I want to feel like that the bow stroke is completed by momentum and by release of that initial muscular impulse. So I try to, for example, swing my arm in a kind of a U shape like this, so that the bow weight is preserved through the stroke without me having to muscularly create the weight or the pressure of the bow on the string. So that's an example of that. Vibrato, I try to think of it the same way. I try to think of it as flinging my hand, water off my hand, so I have an impulse, but then there's immediately physical muscular release after that. So that's another principle that I think of. And then a third principle, breathing, and then impulse and release. And so incidentally, I like to spend a lot more of my time in the release part of the muscular action than the impulse. The impulses are more like little flashes of light rather than intense spotlight left on. And then the last principle I would say is I want everything in my body to be loose, but I don't want to move anything more than I have to. And so what I mean by that is, for example, when I was younger, I learned that opening my elbow would be helpful for keeping my bow straight at the tip. Okay, so, which is true. It's very true, right? But the only problem is if I move my elbow more than I have to, I might, for example, take away the function of my shoulder in opening to the tip. So, in fact, that happened. So I think it was probably Paul Katz that helped me with opening my shoulder when I would take down bows, and not just the elbow. So the reason why that's good is because, first of all, it makes my playing more efficient in my elbow, but also by having my shoulder be relaxed or mobile, then I get that sort of relaxation all the way through the body. Otherwise, if you sort of relax some joints but not others, so all the joints have to be relaxed in order for this all to work, then you're kind of creating blocks of energy. Like the mass of my upper body cannot become part of the bow stroke if I'm only bowing from my elbow like this, right? So that's the other principle is I want of relaxation. I want all my joints to be relaxed, but I don't want to move any one of them more than I have to. So those are some general things, but like I said, there's so many aspects of getting your body to work efficiently and in a relaxed way that could also be a full hour talk, I think, too. Okay, here's another one. In what ways does playing professionally in a string quartet affect the way you play and practice individually? So I view chamber music as the most wonderful thing for me personally, especially musically speaking, because I think, and especially you think about this in these last several weeks and months that we've been all isolated, I think the thing that really could choke me as a musician or as a creative person is just only being in an echo chamber and hearing my own thoughts. And you could extrapolate and think of that in larger ways in life too, how seems like segments of our society have gotten trapped in the echo chamber of your own thoughts. And the best way to correct that or to address that, to me, is hearing thoughts besides your own, which is why freedom of speech is so important and dialogue in society is so important, and not just hanging out with the people who necessarily agree with you. So in quartet, it's perfect. I hang out, at least when we rehearse, which is why it's been so difficult lately. I hang out with three people who have different ideas from me musically, and maybe technically too. And those are ways of potential growth for me. So that's huge for me. That affects how I think of music. That affects how I think of playing the cello. That affects me when I'm practicing on my own. And of course, it affects our rehearsals a lot when I spend more time listening to what everyone else has to say than sharing what I think, which I already know about the music, and hopefully is coming through in my playing of the cello part when we're rehearsing. So rehearsing string quartet is, for me, a fantastic opportunity for my continued growth. Thoughts of vibrato with one finger versus two fingers. So, is it, yeah, Aristide? I would never vibrate like a trill, if that's what you're talking about. So so some people do that to make their vibrato wider. That was a second finger on F, but then I keep my third finger really close. And so it almost is like a mini trill, and it just makes the vibrato wider and more intense. And that most often happens on first finger with the second finger being close. So you can make that first E like crazy sounding intense, but I don't really find that helpful because, first of all, you can't get that sound on every finger. I want all my fingers to sound the same vibrato wise, or able to sound the same at least. So like the poor fourth finger is going to be at such a disadvantage if you're doing these crazy vibratos, those trill vibratos. So I don't really believe in that. I would just keep my fingers high enough and I would try and get the intensity from the looseness of my hand rather than trilling. Okay, so if you mean by using two fingers on vibrato, like the third finger being close to the fourth finger on fourth finger vibrato, I think that can be helpful. Okay, because first of all, if I'm close enough, my hand's still going to be loose, and in fact, the looseness of that third finger can help train my fourth finger, or help remind my fourth finger of what that feels like, because the fourth finger is shorter, so it has less potential flexibility in the joints. So there's a nice free, if I'm close enough, yeah, nice free joints in the third finger vibrato. Harder in the fourth finger vibrato to get that, although I want to get. So I want to be able to get the same sound with my fourth finger vibrato, and having my third finger kind of reinforce and train my fourth finger a little bit. I find that helpful. So I hope that's a good explanation about when you might use two fingers on vibrato. Jihoon, do you have any thoughts on improving the accuracy and power of octaves, particularly in the Dvorak cello concerto? So with octaves, I always practice my thumb first, and thumb alone, although with my third finger on the cello. So I want to make sure that the tone, the pitch, the quality, shifting, everything is happening well with the thumb. Then I feel like I have a much better chance of putting the top in tune and shifting well. So that's how I practice octaves and double stops in general. I always want trying to make sure my lower voice is really strong and well played. That will be my advice specifically. Question from Jin Young: how does one feel and keep my right arm free? Many times I drop my bow when I play. Okay, I'll tell you a story about myself that was mortifying and yet also satisfying. So when I was younger, when I was in conservatory myself, I had a tendency to hold the bow way too tight. And in fact, I even played with a inverted thumb, right? And in fact, that's one of the things that I remember most about Leonard Rose. We talked about that at the beginning of the hour. Teachers had told me it would be much better with your bow hand, David, if you could play with a curved thumb, a rounded thumb, and a relaxed thumb. And I nodded, didn't want to be disagreeable, but I never did anything about it because it's such a hard habit to break. And then Rose in his first lesson said, and on the bow hand, we curve our thumb. And I was like, okay, Leonard Rose says we curve our thumb. I guess I better do it. So for about 6 or 8 weeks, I think I felt like I was a beginner, going to drop my bow. But I concentrated, and eventually I was able to break that habit. And I had other teachers also who are like, like especially when you get to the frog, your thumb can be so relaxed. You should be able to just take the bow out of your hand like this, that loose. And I nodded, but I don't think I ever quite got there. So a few years ago, I was playing with a quartet. I think it was in Sarasota, Florida, if I'm not mistaken. And I took a big up bow preparation like this, breathed, because I was getting for a very energetic down bow, and the bow, whoops, flew right out of my hand and onto the stage, and my quartet didn't stop. I had to quickly reach over and grab it. So it probably took about a total of 5 seconds for that all to happen. But I was mortified. It felt like 5 hours. So who wants to drop their bow on stage? But in retrospect, I felt like, wow. I think it was Ardith Alton, my teacher, who told me, can you take the bow out of your hand at the frog? And I thought, oh, Mrs. Alton would have been so proud of me. I finally held the bow so loose that it fell out of my hand at the frog. So after I got over my embarrassment, I felt a little proud of myself that I finally figured out how to be looser. So in fact, that is one of the keys to having a relaxed bow arm, is to be sure that your thumb does not feel like there's pressure all the time. So if you feel like you're dropping the bow, that's probably not a bad thing. You're going to just hold it tight enough so that you don't drop it. Obviously, it's not a good idea to drop your bow. But if your thumb is loose, you'll get so much more freedom in your fingers at the frog. And then at the tip, the thumb does have to work a little bit in a passive way, I hope. But again, if your thumb is underneath the bow, then just the natural swing of my arm up will get that passive action in my thumb, and then when I come back to the frog, then it's relaxed again. And as I said earlier, this idea of impulse and swing, that is also very helpful for me in making sure that all of this is not, I'm not using muscles, but more mass and momentum in my bow arm. Okay, let's see. Can you recommend a few studies to start playing with the thumb for children? So I don't have a ton of experience, as a disclaimer, of teaching beginners or very young children. Most of my students are at least in their teenagers, and then conservatory students and above. So the question with children is, of course, how to develop, so I'm speaking in theory. I have some ideas that I would try with children if I ever get the opportunity to do it. But so this is me speaking just as a parent, and I do have 2 children myself, and in theory, thinking about cello. So the trick to teaching children would be, for me, if I were to do it, would be how to develop really strong habits on the cello, which can be very particular and kind of fussy, to do things in a really effective way and efficient way on the cello. How much of that you can get while still keeping it fun? Because no kid wants to sit there and be told, like, curve your thumb here and do this and that. So that would be the key. One thing I would, as to my ideas of what I would try if I were teaching a kid first, as a beginner, I would teach thumb position before the low positions. I would start in thumb position right away, as if you're playing violin fingering. And so you could start with all the same pieces that you start. But everything up there, I would just do everything up there, because I think that the hand position up here is easier, actually, and it's also healthier. Like, you get this natural angle to the fingers, natural little bit of angle to the fingers, which is very helpful for vibrato and shifting all up in here. Sometimes when people play down here, I think it starts you off with a kind of a square position, perpendicular to the strings, the fingers, and then as you shift up, then you put your fingers at quite of an angle, because I'm keeping my thumb back here for 7th position, and then in thumb position, when my thumb finally comes up, then look, I get this beautiful, nice, rounded, compact, loose position right here, right? and then here. And so with 3 hand positions, you can imagine how complicated shifting is going to get. So if I were able to learn this position, keep it through 7th position, so now my thumb is not going to go behind, maybe it's on the side, or maybe even just stays up longer. So I'm not afraid of thumb position if I've been using it since the beginning, and I don't feel like, oh, going up to the C, I better keep my thumb back behind the neck because I don't know where the C is. And then, of course, down here, then if I'm able to keep that same angle. So now I have 1 finger angle all the way up and down the cello. So that's one thing I would do with kids, is I would actually start in thumb position. Another thing that I would be curious to do if I were teaching kids is I would put my, I would start with 4th finger instead of 1st finger. So I learned 1, 3, 4. And so sometimes if I didn't have my fingers in like this, my 4th finger would be so straight and so weak like this. So if I learned good hand position from the 4th finger and then brought it back to the 1st finger, I think that's an easier way to get healthy hand position, or a more efficient hand position. So those are a couple of things left-hand wise that I would do with kids if I had the chance to start someone and it could experiment. Okay, let's see, where did I left off here? Do you have any recommendations on how to work specific practice habits in order to improve the accuracy of the left hand for intonation? Okay, so for the left hand intonation, yes. So I have the left hand divided up into three different tasks. So one is hand position, the other is shifting, and the other is vibrato. So if you're talking about left hand for intonation, it's mainly hand position and shifting. So that's one thing that I would do, is I would make sure that my hand was organized that way, and I chose fingerings that were that. And then I have exercises, maybe not enough time to get into them right now, of how to get a good consistent hand position, and then how to shift effectively. So hand position, like I would do things like I don't know if anyone's ever done those Kosman exercises. I like those. I like double stops a lot for hand position. I like also making sure my fingers are very fast but not forceful with the fingers up and down. I like making sure that I have enough, as much energy lifting my fingers as putting them down. So those are all good physical habits. And then with shifting, I would just do it systematically, and again, make sure I have good physical habits of heavy on the note, light in the shift, heavy on the note that you're going to. Okay, so again, I think a lot of teachers have wonderful exercises and to develop good healthy habits for the physical motions you need to do. But there is one thing that has more to do with playing in tune than any physical setup or any motion that you could practice, that you could ever practice on the cello, and that is your ears. So without good ears, you will never play beautifully in tune. So that's the first thing, actually, that I would probably work on, is being able to sing notes well, being able to play scales, be able to play scales well against open strings, because that's what good intonation is. It's hearing what something ought to be compared to something else, right? There's as wonderful as perfect pitches, that is not a guarantee that you play well in tune. In fact, sometimes it's sort of a handicap. If your D is so fixed in your head and someone's playing a slightly different A and you need to get it in tune with each other, it can sometimes be a bit of a distraction. So that's it's something to train the ear is super important. And so here's one thing that I would say with practicing shifting, to get your ear involved, because for a long time I think, and I see a lot of young people, shifting is like you can memorize the feeling of it. Like I know where fourth position is. It's where my thumb goes right there in the neck, and so there's my third finger. That's an F sharp. But what's really going to make you play in tune is not how it feels, but how it sounds. So I try to practice my shifts. If I come across a shift that's difficult, say I just want to do this octave shift. I'm going to go from C to C. So So instead of thinking, okay, well, that high C is that's like when seventh position, when I put my thumb there, I just reach up as high as I can. I did that when I was younger. I'm gonna shift slowly, and while I'm doing the light part of the shift, the glide, I'm going to listen, and I know what the high C sounds like before I get there. That's super important. If I don't know what it sounds like before I get there, then I'm kind of in trouble. So I have to be able to recognize when am I getting there? And then when I get there, I drop my hand weight, and I put vibrato in too, because I like doing that. So... And same thing for going down. I'll listen. When am I getting to that C? And then drop the weight when I get to the C. And I will do the same thing with my bow, just to kind of reinforce the feeling in both hands. So that's how I practice shifts, to make sure that my ear is guiding the shift and not some sense of physical memory. Okay? And that has helped me a lot. I remember I used to get very uptight about the height of my chair. I mean, I'm still particular about that. But and the angle of my cello, and if it wasn't quite right, because then the shift felt different, and of course, like I said, I was like sort of measuring things from where my thumb was. That's all helpful, but what really matters is if you can hear the shift. If I can hear the shift before I do it, and if I can hear the note before I play it, my arrival note, there's way better chance that I will play in tune than by some sort of feel or remembering the angle of my cello or anything like that. So I try and make sure as much as I try to work healthy habits in my left hand playing, I try to remember the ear is the thing that's really in charge of everything. And not only intonation, but kind of all things music. So finding ways for your ear to be involved in your playing is kind of the key to playing the cello well. Oh, Anastasia, you're 8 years old. Wow, good for you. I didn't start cello till I was 11, so you have a big head start on me. Sometimes the fingers of my right hand slip when I'm playing and holding the bow. Do you have tips? Yes, I do. So, Anastasia, here's what I would do. Even before I play, I would do things to move around the bow and still hold the bow lightly, right? So I try to hold the bow with my fingertips, first of all, because that's what I pick up things. When I pick up something... If I pick up something, I will always use my fingertips. That's the most sensitive part of your finger. So I will try and feel the bow with my fingertips, and that'll also allow the rest of my hand to be more relaxed. Then I'll hold it as lightly as I can without dropping it, because that's important. We talked about that earlier this hour. And then I'll just move my bow around. How about that? Like when I was little, I did windshield wipers like this. And it can do windshield wipers in different directions. And sometimes if you're just watching the screen, watching TV or watching a video, just hold the bow and move it around like this. I recommend doing it in a carpeted area though, because sometimes the bow might fall out of your hand, right? So if you can move your bow all around this way, then when you can rest your bow on the string and you don't have to support the bow, it'll feel even easier to hold the bow and hopefully not feel like you're going to drop it. So another one that I remember doing when I was younger is, do you ever do the spider, going up the spider spout? Like this, right? Again with the fingertips. And then hard is going the other direction. Very hard, but very good. If you can do that, then your fingers are getting very good at holding the bow. Your fingers. Ah, made it. Okay? I used to have races on that, and it's easy to cheat when you're going, like this. No fair cheating. You want to feel your fingertips walking on the bow when you do this exercise. Okay, there's some good exercises for learning how to hold the bow loosely, but also securely. Discuss how to choose, question from Chelsea, choosing consonant sounds and articulations to use in your interpretations of pieces. Thank you. So I think that's a great idea, Chelsea, that you think of articulation in terms of language, because it's true, isn't it? You can make a K sound, very sharp articulation, or a more M sound, so thinking of in terms of language is a great way to sort of attune your ear to what's happening with how you're controlling the sound. And by the way, I will also add, I think you can do vowels on the cello too. So when I'm close to the bridge and I hear a lot of high overtones, that's like E's. And then A's, a little off that, O's, Oo's as I get up towards the fingerboard. So you can make vowel sounds too on the cello. So how do you decide in music what articulation to use? Well, some things There are some clues that you will see in music. For example, if I saw a staccato in the music, that would mean to me short in some way, or an accent would be some extra emphasis at the beginning of the note. But just like in language, there's many ways that you can do that. Like you could make emphasis on the beginning of the note, like a K, or it just could be a lean. The accent could be even more with a vibrato. So articulation is not even just a matter of what the bow is doing. Ultimately, how you choose articulation, for me, should be just how you choose language. So I don't think we go through the day thinking, so if my son hasn't picked up his room and it's like the third time I've asked him, I don't think, okay, it's the third time I ask him, I'm going to put a little bit more strength in my consonants. Nathaniel, go clean up your room. So he hears a mark. I think we just speak that way. So I would try just singing melodies and see what consonants come out of your mouth, like a scat singer. I think that's a good way to do it. Now, this is, of course, after you've already studied the music and seen what clues the composer has given you. But past that, there's so many ways you can hear music, and I think there should be so many ways we hear music. I think just in the same way that each of us would say a sentence, Nathaniel, go clean up your room, and sound quite different, I think it should be that way on the cello too. So I think trusting yourself, as long as you've listened and studied the piece and thought about it, and experimented yourself and tried singing it a few times, that would be a great way to figure it out. You can always ask advice of other people. Do you think this is effective? Do you find this compelling, the way I'm playing is, the way I'm starting notes? And get feedback from other people. But my guess is that if you sincerely sort of feel music a certain way, it's going to come across pretty compellingly. And as long as you are, within the parameters that the composer has set up. So I encourage you to trust yourself, Chelsea. Let's see. Thank you from Bolivia. Wow, greetings. Warm-up exercises that you would recommend. So I have a whole series of warm-up exercises that I use with my students, largely around those principles of trying to get all the joints moving, right? So all the joints moving and freedom in your body. So when I start in the morning, sometimes, especially at my age, my back's not as free. So I have a whole series of them. There are probably too many to go through all right now, but I try to make them simple enough that they apply to every situation on the cello, and also simple enough that you could do it for 10 seconds and get some benefit out of it, and 10 minutes and get some benefit out of it. Because sometimes we have a long time to warm up available. Sometimes we have very little time to warm up. So I would like to be able to scale it so to whatever time I have. But basically, the areas that I would think of warming up is my core, right? So I want to have some ways that I can feel free in my back. And then my breathing also loosens my spine. I feel like when I inhale and exhale, my spine gets taller and smaller. Those are handy things just to do to start off. And then bowing exercises. As I said, position, shifting, and vibrato are the three things that I try and warm up in my left hand. So there are many ways that people do that, but I try to warm up those three things for sure. And then sometimes just the basic motion of the bow is just enough. I can get that tied into my breathing. That's enough to get me started. So I can go into more detail. Maybe at a future cello chat we can do one whole hour on warming up. But actually, when I teach these exercises to my students, I usually takes 3 lessons. Leonard Rose had it down to 1 though, so maybe someday I will learn his way. Let's see. Some thoughts about the motion of the right elbow in various scenarios. We started talking a little bit about that, about how I find that when people are young, myself included, I got better at moving my elbow than I did about moving my shoulder. And I got better at moving my wrist than I did about moving my fingers. So the latter part of my life has been trying to get my shoulder to catch up to my elbow and my fingers to surpass my wrist. Because the fingers are such a powerful tool on the cello. There's so many joints and there's so much possible control. So I've really worked hard to make sure my fingers are operating in a way that's helpful. The elbow in particular, so it's hard to talk, it's, as you were probably gathering, it's hard for me to talk about one joint in isolation from the rest because everything is so interconnected. So the best thing I could say, the thing I would want to most say is this thing about every joint flexible, no joint moving more than it has to. Because honestly, like at the A string, my elbow is going to be more active. Actually, my shoulder is too, in a certain way than the C string, because everything is closer in here. So when I'm reaching up to the A string, I have to sort of. So everything is kind of different in every situation. So the key thing is to have flexibility, and an awareness of like how much you have to move versus how little you can get away with. The less movement, actually, in my opinion, the better, as long as it's not locked. Right? I want all the joints to be able to move, but I want them to move the least possible while still being able to get the job done. And so now that my shoulder, I've tried to get it more relaxed, so then my elbow is actually less active than it probably used to be when I played. I used to play more like a violin form, like this. Although I think the good violinists, they also use their shoulder too. Okay, I know that's a kind of a cop-out answer about that, but like I said, it's hard to talk about one joint in particular versus the whole arm if everything is getting worked out. And now if something is locked completely, then you need to work to get it loose. So for example, like my thumb, when it was totally locked, I need to figure out how to get it loose, and when my thumb got looser, then my fingers could get a lot looser too. Okay, so that's where a situation where I would work on specifically on one joint, but otherwise, in many ways, I think you have to put the whole picture together. Let's see, question from Alex. Tips for playing in the thumb position. As I use my thumb as an anchor, I find myself tensing up. Yep. So I think you're onto something there, Alex. If you press your thumb down the whole time, then there's no way your hand can be relaxed. Remember, you want things to be loose all the time. And and also my one principle about muscular impulse, when muscles stay turned on, like a spotlight on the whole time, that means you can't relax. So I would use my thumb in thumb position like all the other fingers. So I think, at least when you get less insecure about playing the cello, but most of us learned in first position first. As I said, if I were starting someone, I would start in thumb position. But at the beginning, you leave all the fingers down because it's a way to feel like I know where the next one is if I leave the old one down. But as you get better, you rotate your forearm and you let the fingers up and down just the same way as like when you're walking. You don't leave both feet down all the time. You lift one when the other one goes. So I would do that with a thumb in thumb position too. So not lifting it up in the air, but release it. So only press it down when you're actually playing. So if I'm playing a C major scale, it's dropped there. I'm trying to drop it just like I drop my fingers here. It's a little different arm position, but so now as soon as my first finger goes down, my thumb is released. Sorry. And you'll be able to play much faster if you do that too. As you said, you're feeling your hand lock up. So I that's one advice that I would give, and I would also give the advice like when you shift, to really lift and shift with your thumb. So practicing thumb shifts is something that doesn't get practiced as much as down here because we spend a lot of time down here at the beginning not using the thumb. But you being able to so I would practice shifting the thumb up there too, and that's another thing that will help you get your thumb to feel like the other fingers. And then one additional thought about thumb position is we just don't spend as much time up there. So I think you need to turn that upside down a little bit if you really want to get security in thumb position. Spend a lot of time with etudes that are really focused in thumb position, so that you just flip the amount of time that you're spending up here versus down here. And as a string quartet cellist, that's even more so for me, because quartet parts are rarely are they really up here at the top of the cello, sometimes in here, but so I find it important when I sit down to practice etudes, as I actually have had some time to do lately, which is nice. I find myself gravitating towards ones that keep me in thumb position. Let's see. Any tips, comments on the Dvorak fast triplets passage before the melodic slow theme? I wonder if that's the one that we're talking about, because I don't think there's any triplets before that. Yeah, so maybe this. Well, this. So the first thing I do is I try and make sure that my double stops are in tune. So I practice those all as double stops to be in tune. The ricochet part of it, I do have some tips that for ricochet that make it a little bit easier. And one thing that I think is helpful about a lot of people immediately jump the tempo forward faster in this passage. I think it's helpful if it stays the same tempo or close to it as before and after. So some tips for ricochet I find is like ricochet works a lot better. So you're relying on the natural resilience of the bow when you're playing ricochet. So one helpful thing about ricochet is if you can play with flatter hair, you'll get much more of the bow's natural resilience working for you. So if I'm over on the side of my bow, like on the, tilting towards me, the bow will stay on the string more. But if I keep the bow flatter and maybe even a little, so it's leaning away, I'll get much more ricochet. And the other thing, the hair has to grab quickly without you pressing, because if you press, then that also you'll squash the natural resilience of the bow out. So rosining your bow well will also help you ricochet. That depends on how often you rosin your bow, but I rosin my bow every day. I did not rosin my bow as much when I was younger, and rosin is a huge help. Makes playing the cello a lot easier. I didn't realize that. Plus, it's the only thing about cello that's not like super expensive. Like rehairs, new bows, cellos, strings, new bridges, everything seems like it costs quite a bit of money, but rosin actually doesn't too much. So, and it can help you playing a lot. So it is possible to rosin too much, but in my experience, and especially in my own life, I think there are many more times when I didn't rosin enough rather than too much. Let's see. Advice to young quartets in terms of rehearsal efficiency and making decisions on musical ideas. We talked a little bit about this, but if you came into rehearsal every day thinking, what could I learn, rather than what could I say, what could I tell my colleagues, I think all rehearsals would probably go faster and more efficiently and more joyously too. So I don't mean that people shouldn't share their own ideas and how they think should go, because that's important too. But it's different when the first impulse is like, what can I receive and reflect back, rather than what can I just transmit out. It's a very different dynamic. So that's one recommendation I would have right off the bat. I would try also to express your ideas about music as much as possible when you're playing. When you have to go to words, we all have to go to words at some point, but when we have to go to words, it's actually can be misunderstood more easily in some ways, funnily enough. Words can help. Another thing that I would say about rehearsing is if I shared ideas in the form of a question, it invites, again, this idea of ideas being reflected back and forth between each other rather than just being transmitted out. So that's another suggestion I would give, is if you felt like the movement was too aggressive and fast, instead of saying, I think we should go slower, I think you should play less rough, if you said, what if we thought of this movement as something more gentle or possibly slower? What do you guys think of that? Then that invites their interaction with the idea as opposed to their decision of like, do I want to take his idea or do I want to fight with them? So those are some little suggestions I would say that might help rehearsing. Let's see. Any advice for practicing arpeggios of the 30-second notes? I assume that's the passage right there. So I would practice dotted rhythms a lot. So So dotted rhythms are a good way to play slow and fast at the same time because you get little pauses, right? So then you flip where the slow part is. So then it's... Sorry, I'm playing a couple wrong notes there. That's one thing I would do for sure. And then the other thing that I would do if you're trying to get it faster is practice in clumps, so that you turn several motions to play notes into one complicated motion. So like, for example, sorry, right? So this, you got string crossings, you got note changes. So I'm doing this by memory. Yeah, there we go. Right? So I'll do that, and then... So all those note changes and shifts become one fluid motion. And then gradually, I'll paste those clumps together. So... Right? So that's another thing I would do besides dotted rhythms. I would also try, in my left hand, this idea of speed and not force, because the more force I use, the slower my hand gets. So, well, I practice it abstractly as an exercise like this. And lifting too. And if you hear your fingers banging on the fingerboard, then you're using too much force. So those are some ideas that I would say that would help you play, get the speed going in those arpeggios. Yeah, there's a lot of gymnastics in that piece. That's a great piece, isn't it? Ismar, hello, how are you? How do you work with students in developing a looser, wider vibrato? So I try and get more flexibility in the hand rather than thinking wider. So I have learned vibrato over the years as being, instead of rotating my forearm like this, as being more rolling my fingers like this. So in fact, my arm doesn't really spin much at all. It's more like, feels like dribbling a basketball, right? So, and then if I can get like way on the tip of my finger here, and then as I straighten my finger backwards, just rolling the tip of my finger gives me about a semitone, and I don't see any reason why vibrato should even be a semitone wide. That's kind of too much, right? So I think there's plenty of width even for, and I have, by the way, pretty skinny fingers. That's why for a long time I thought the route to getting a richer and wider vibrato would be flattening my fingers, but I actually have changed my mind on that. So I think it's rolling my fingertip like this. So if I can get my hand this flexible and rolling this much, then I can get plenty of width, even with, as I said, with my skinny fingers. The one advantage I have over a shorter person is my fingers are maybe a little longer, so this motion becomes slightly bigger. But my experience is even with people with smaller hands, there's plenty of width here. So then the idea is to get your hand free so that when you roll your fingertip, it feels like, as I said, like flinging water off your hand. So. So my vibrato is more like that, and I'm just kind of flinging water off my hand. Keeping my finger in one place. It's not sliding, it's just rolling the fingertip. So that's a little, in a nutshell. It'd probably be explained a little bit more thoroughly than that, but in a nutshell, that's what I would go for if I want a vibrato that's a little bit wider. I would also say, okay, so with wide vibrato, it's important that there be like a good sense of pitch too, right? So I try and make sure that my vibrato is faster going up, that's the fling part, than it is going down, so that I can hear the top of it. So I get E, I can hear right where the E is, right? Because otherwise a wide vibrato has the possibility of sounding diffuse with the pitch. So I think that's important too. Another question. Oh, I see our hour is almost over too. We'll get as many as we can, otherwise we'll have to save some for next time. When I play cello, my muscles feel really tired, and I feel really tired. Are there exercises I can do daily to help with my fingers? Anything to do to stretch them? You know, sometimes playing the cello, it depends on what stage you are at. Like, it's a lot like, I view it a lot like exercising. So if I have not been exercising and working out, I feel really weak if I go to exercise. And I also find that like exercising at different times of day, I might feel kind of weak. So I think it's a complicated question, not knowing exactly you so well. I'm not sure exactly what might be going into this, but one thing I like to do about practicing in order to feel my best is, first of all, pick the time of day that I'm going to be my best. So actually, I was not a morning person when I was younger, but I practice much better in the morning now, and that is provided I got enough sleep the night before too. Okay, so many factors go into your sort of feeling of wellness. Sometimes if you're too hungry, it's hard to practice. Sometimes if you're too full, it's hard to practice. I feel drowsy. Sometimes if you try and practice right after I've been doing, like lately I've been at home, so I've been like digging holes in my yard and trying to take weeds out and things. If I try to practice right after doing a lot of physical exertion, then that feels different then too. So I would try to find the time of day when your mind is alert, number one, when my body feels not worn out. I would try to make sure that I'm eating and sleeping. Those things are important. I'm hydrated, water. I would also try and get routine in my practicing. So if you practice 4 hours one day and then, oh, that exhausted me, and then I'm not going to practice again for the next 5 days till I feel good again. When you come back after those 5 days, I guarantee you'll still feel exhausted. So like a little bit at regular intervals is much better for developing, sort of a feeling of wellness at the cello, I think. So I think those are some things that could help with, as far as, lifestyle and general health. Oh, by the way, I also recommend, I think cello playing uses such particular exercise muscles and motions that I think if cello playing is the only kind of exercise you do, I don't think it's particularly helpful. So as I said, I do yard work. Sometimes I run. I also like to play basketball with my son from time to time. I think anything you do, even if it's go for a walk, that's physical, besides playing the cello, will on some level help you play the cello better, so that your body is balanced, so that you're generally in good muscular condition, so your breathing is good. So any form of activity or even exercise besides playing the cello, I think is very helpful for the cello too. So I wouldn't practice so much that there's no time for anything else. Let's see, try those things and see if they help you. We'll do a couple more. If it's okay, I'm willing to stay on a few minutes extra, since there are a lot of questions. Maybe we'll go till 10 after or so. Hello from Japan. So great to have people from other countries. I mean, if I can just say my own personal opinion, one of the wonderful things about Cello Bello and online things, and especially lately, has been the ability to be in touch with people you wouldn't. And there's so many online cello activities now, music activities. They've just proliferated, and I think it's really wonderful. And actually, I'll put in a small plug for my festival that I run, the Bowdoin International Music Festival. We're offering all of our offerings, some to our students that would have come this summer, and some to the general public, to anyone. It's all completely free of charge. I'm so happy that our festival has been able to do that, and that we're hopefully going to get a little bit of the spirit of our festival online. I'm also involved in one cello festival called Vivace. I believe Cello Bello is involved, and you probably may see some notice of it on Cello Bello other places too, later in the summer. But as I said, there's so many wonderful online ways to connect and exchange information these days especially. So I'm really happy about that. So let's see, Yoshi. What brand of strings are you using? What's the reason for your choice of strings? Resonance and color are the two most important things that I use strings for. So first of all, I want the cello to ring freely. And so how thick or thin of a string you use, what materials, has a lot to do with how freely the sound sort of escapes from the cello. I want the more ringing, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But just ringing on its own is not good enough. I also want a certain amount of color and warmth in the sound, and also ability to shape the color of the sound. Probably even more important than the particular color of it itself is my ability to shape and control the color. So I'm looking for that too. For example, in the C string, it'd be nice to have like just a ringing sound, but if it's too metallic or gritty sounding, and I can't make sort of the warm, throbby sounds that I want to make sometimes, then it would not be a good string choice for me. What I'm using today is Yargar Forte A, Yargar Medium D, Spiracore. Sometimes I use just the steel Spiracores on the C and the G because this cello has so much natural darkness that they don't sound too metallic. I believe these today might be tungsten though, so sometimes I use different ones. But a lot of the time I just use steel ones on the bottom too. This setup might not work on every cello. I think every cello is different, and so as I said, to get the resonant quality and the tonal qualities, the warmth and the ability to control and mold the sound, could be different. You know what string I would really use a lot more if I could? It's just hard for me to deal with tuning them so much. Are gut strings, because I think gut strings offer such incredible tonal qualities, and also encourage you to shape the sound in certain ways with your bow. That's very healthy. So if you ever get the chance to experiment with gut strings, I would highly recommend it. Hi, started playing the cello again after 25 years. How wonderful. Having a hard time releasing left-hand tension, which impairs vibrato, among other things. Yeah, I'll say. Tension impairs a lot of things. So, as I said, I don't know if you were on earlier, or is it Luciana? Luciana, I don't know if you were on earlier, but I try to make sure that all of my muscular motions on the cello are followed by release. And I think of them as impulses. So, for example, if I put my finger down, or if I lift it up, I want it to be a quick and decisive motion, because you need to have articulation and you need to play with confidence. But I try to make it as quick as possible, the release. And also, in the case of putting your fingers and lifting out, I try to make that a light feeling. So in other words, that speed in the left hand is much more important than force. So here's force. And that especially is a force that doesn't release. As once I put it down, I keep pressing down, all right? So I'm going to try and do... So now I'm using more speed and less force. So one way that you can get your hand in a position to do that, so position is important, is to make sure that your fingers are going straight down and not like this. So if your fingers are a little straight, it encourages you to push back with your thumb, and that is force right there. So I try to make sure that my fingers are a little bit more rounded, as I said, sort of going straight down to the floor, right? And then I try to be able to play without my thumb even there. So sometimes I practice, playing. So you can't see, but my thumb was actually not touching the neck when I did that, to just guarantee that I was doing that. And then the impulse thing is really, really important, I think, where you don't keep pressing that string down, where you feel like your fingers are bouncing instead of down, stay down until you go up. Okay? When I add in, when I have that feeling of bouncing, then it's easier for me to put vibrato immediately in. And because my vibrato, I don't know if you were on earlier, but I think of my vibrato as like also mostly release and very little impulse, just like flinging my hand. So then my vibrato is basically also going to be like a releasing thing. So if I can put my finger down and immediately go to vibrato as a releasing kind of motion, the vibrato actually helps relax my hand. So there's some general thoughts right there. There's another question. Do you have any thoughts on how weight is distributed among the fingers when we are playing in thumb position? So again, I don't know if you heard this earlier, but I try to make sure my fingers lift. So the way I describe it is like when you walk, you can't see me walking because of the screen, but it's very natural to put one foot down and lift the other one just as the other one is going down, right? So I feel like that you kind of want to do that with fingers too. Your fingers should walk. You've got four, except you've got 4 or 5, I guess, legs, feet. But, so I want basically the hand to be balanced on whatever finger is playing at the moment, just the same as we do down here. So I think that's important here. The thing in thumb position that can happen, as what I was saying earlier, is we get the thumb and we kind of use it like a capo on the guitar, just slam it down, and now it's going to hold down that fifth, and right. So I don't think that's helpful. It might feel at first like a security blanket, like okay, I know where now I know where that fifth is. But what I detailed and very amorphous, and above all I want sound to communicate. And so like if you're thinking of how words communicate, even if you speak softly, you have to be able to hear the sounds of person's voices making, consonants, vowels, whatever. So I find that easier to do when my bow contact is a little bit stronger. So for example, in that sound that's a little bit more focused, now I can hear the detail of the vibrato, whereas it's more fuzzed over there. It's like my wearing glasses, but the prescription is not quite correct, right? So then for me, the question is, how do I project intimacy or softness in the sound? And that has a lot to do with, as you say, vibrato has a big choice is bow speed, right? So, for example, even if it's soft, if I play with a lot of bow speed, it creates a lot more energy. If I make my vibrato wide, it's going to immediately kind of project this kind of opening of your throat. If I want to keep it more closed in, as if I were speaking something more intimately, I'm going to choose. For me, I'm going to choose a vibrato that's actually maybe a little faster and narrower, right? So. and combine that with the whatever energy of how I'm moving the bow speed wise or tapering it. Maybe that's what gives the impression of dynamic in a more complete way than just, okay, I'm going to use this vibrato for loud or this for soft or this kind of work for the bow. Let's see if I answered that question. So yes, you want to hear differences though. So I am going to think about manipulating things. So if I want to play louder, and I want, or make more energy in the sound, so I am going to think about bow speed, and along with that, I'm going to let the vibrato open up a little bit as you like it. Everyone has their own way of combining these elements, and they should. Just like my tone of voice sounds different from every other person on this planet. So you want to have your own cello sound. So you experiment and see what makes you happy. And then the trick is to be able to manipulate that. So sometimes when I practice my scales, I'll practice scales with dynamics. So like if, for example, so I'm manipulating the bow speed and changing the width and intensity and speed of my vibrato to kind of change the energy of the sound. I said dynamics, but I'm basically just trying to change the energy of my sound, so I can control it and manipulate it, because that's what will happen when you're playing a piece. Is you want to be able, okay, now I feel the tension going down, or now I feel lots of excitement. So that's what you want to be able to do, is manipulate the sound. So that's what I do. I try and make my scale practicing more interesting that way too. Okay, yeah, I guess it's a good time to close down the questions. It was so fun to be here and fun to have the chance to think about the cello, like I said. Fun to have friends from all over the world too. I will say that's maybe one of the silver linings, I hope, of what we're all going through these days, is being able to be in touch with people that you wouldn't normally have come across. So thanks for joining me, and keep checking Cello Bello and checking out more online activity. Bye for now.